This conversation will be about the fires in the Pantanal that has been going on for a long time now, and about COVID in Brazil, and what does that mean in the context of political Brazilian. She invited Luciano, who's showing in the picture now. He's a historian, he's a professor, and he's gonna talk about the thing that I said. Ana Paula is also joining us, and Estevão is also joining, but there was some problems. He's gonna come up later. We can start now. One of the things I wanted to talk about is a news from the New York Times, published 2 days ago, so you can understand the size of these events. It's not an environmental problem that happens every day and every year. And it's not only about Brazil, it's something that affects the world. And that's why we're translating so people around the world can understand the problem. She's gonna show now. Oh, this is Steven.
Apparently we're having some technical problems with Stevan. He can't hear the rest of the members. Okay, apparently it's fixed, so you can get on.
Before we start, I wanna show you 2 images to show what is Pantanal. It's a biome, a Brazilian biome, very specific one. First picture will show you on the map where is it, this region in Brazil. Yeah, this is Brazil. And the blue space in the map is what we call Pantanal, which looks small in relation to Brazil, but it's pretty big. Only the area where the fires occurred, it's the size of Greece, so it's pretty big. This is where the Pantanal is, and this is the region, and 1/4 from the data presented, they say it's burned out, and it's still burning out. Now she's showing a video to show how the fires are. Yeah, this is the video of the fires. She's explaining how the fire is gonna affect not only the vegetation, but the fisheries and all the actions that involves this biome. And also it's gonna affect other countries around us and all the regions around the Pantanal. Estevão, he's been working a lot to help the people with the fires. Now he's gonna talk about himself and what he's been doing to help and how is the fires affecting him.
Good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all again. My name is Luciano. So I'm also called Estevinho because my father is called Estevão as well. That's how I'm known. Estevão Bororó Talcane. I'm a part of the association Tugo Baigare, also called Tug Association. It's our own nickname for it. Tugo Baigare is a word for an ancient warrior Indian civilization. They're sort of the front line of Indian armies, I guess you call them, that also take care of the people and the villages. I'm here today in the name of my leader, who's in the village, and I come to represent all of them, to speak for them, for all of our community. So the Tuga Baigari Association started mobilizing an initiative of campaign because we spent this year, much like the other ones, it's what we call the environment challenges. So the pandemic and some personal assaults. So our village has been the most affected. Thankfully, no residents were burned because our tribesmen, both men and women, were very brave, and they all came to rescue and managed to put out the fire. So we had no human losses nor material losses.
I imagine there's a lot of fog around the area, even if it was not burned. Did you change the region where you lived because of the fog?
Well, the fire was so intense that because of that, there was also a lot of smoke afterwards. There was a moment in which was needed the help of the public health services from the region in order to rescue at-risk population to bring to a healthcare facility. So the elderly, pregnant women, uh, also small children, and the remaining were relocated to the Tagamani village, a neighboring village, until the smokes and the fires could be controlled. But many respiratory problems, for example, began to show up. But that whole ordeal only lasted about 15 days, and they came back to the village. And we're about to restart this journey that we're undertaking now. But one thing that I want to make clear is that the fires did not start in the indigenous lands. They started outside and spread to our territory. There have been a lot of speculations on how these fires were started, and there's a lot of misinformation, and we don't know exactly, but a lot of people suspect that these are criminous activities, arson, and it has been affecting not only us but also the biodiversity and the environment, of course. One thing that I saw personally was next to our village. I saw one monkey by himself struggling and trying to reach the rest of his species, I guess, but he looked very lost.
I remember one of the reasons why I met you. It's because from during some time a poster was circulating on WhatsApp and on Facebook that your association was receiving some donations to help all the people who were affected by the fires. How are the donations happening? How is it organized? She also asks what does he need from the donation?
So first of all, I want to thank from the bottom of my heart everybody who takes some of their time. This is one of those moments that you realize that there are good people out there, the people who get involved in our cause. So again, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Even just watching this live stream and being involved and informed is already a big step. So the Togo Bagari Association, after the fires and once COVID subsides, we're gonna socially retake the villages, and Lucio Mariano, my leader, my tribal leader, we want to start a new journey. With that purpose, the donations that we're receiving, they're being utilized for, we're using them not only for ourselves but also for other villages that are located far away, and we're trying to reach out to the other communities that perhaps don't have the same resources that we have, all the way for Curitiba and Mato Grosso, which are other Brazilian states. With regards to our financial donations, we're gonna utilize those for retaking our community. We have two priorities right now. The first one is
Food sustainability and
environmental preservation.
yeah.
So one thing that we need a lot is drinkable water, and we're trying to focus on that as well. And we're trying to make sustainable plantations, community-driven plantations for rice, beans, corn. So we're trying to seek out partnerships for the sustainability project. But one thing that has to be said is that all of our initiatives are being linked back to sustainability and environmental protection, and to seek out alternative sustainable initiatives and projects. That's the main focus of our donations. That's where they're being funneled into. So just for example, we also can make this time of pandemic and of burnings a time for reflection. What can we do to better the lives of our people? What do we have to rethink as a society in order to build a sustainable project? Something that can help us achieve a better future and a better quality of life in the future. And now we have problems that are global, problems that are regional, problems that are local, and we have to articulate ourselves to tackle all of these different issues. So, in a word, it's a sustainable project that we're undertaking.
I hope that for now on, people's mentality change globally in the sense of sustainability and the knowledge that these donations and this knowledge is not new. They are not new. A lot of communities already did this and they were already sustainable communities, but before they were oppressed, and this oppression brought social effects to this community and also environmental effects. And now what I feel is happening, it's these things that were oppressed, they are appearing again after this oppression. So now we're learning from this oppression and to relearn this knowledge that was already here. Thinking about like European people and sustainability here is something that always comes to conversation, but it always comes as something new and something new that we're starting to do now. But this is not a new concept. It's coming back now, and it's a concept that has always happened in these communities. So now we have to have a dialogue with this community, with people who already have this concept in mind. So now I think what's happening is that I think that you have a lot to contribute to other people, especially here, with this concept of sustainability.
Yes, for sure. The indigenous lands, they have a very important role to play, not only for the biodiversity, but also for their human potential. And now I believe this is becoming clearer. It was always there, but now it's clearer for people to see, for a social environmental configuration, that the potential for not only for water resources, but also for alternative medicines that now can possibly have been burned. And one of the goals of their association is to spread the knowledge of these alternative medicines and um, informal knowledges.
Now he's talking about, it's the audio is cutting, but he's talking about how, yeah, the climate's changing because of every environmental damage we've been suffering. And he's saying that the climate change is already happening, it's here. And like his tribe is also suffering, his community is also suffering. So it's not just one specific case or specific cases, they're all part of a whole. Yeah, she's saying that now it's like he said, it's very important to remember that it's a global issue, but but the but the effects that are of the things that are happening in Brazil right now, they are subjected to some political problems that are happening in the background. And now she's asking Luciano, the professor, to tell how this political background is dealing with this problem.
Hello to everyone. It's a great satisfaction to be here. I appreciate the invitation. It's very good to meet Steven again. We've worked together before, 20 years ago. I have a lot of fondness for this project where we worked together. We were able to perform many activities in the university, and yeah, it's very good to see him again, to be here with him. I thank Luna as well, and Ana Paula. It's a pleasure to meet you. I think it was very well put, the points raised by Stefan, and all the emergencies and crises that we're living today. Everything they brought up before I talk too much, I want to remind us of what he said in the beginning. Stefan said that the purpose of his tribe is to rebloom or to restart the indigenous communities' culture and way of life. And I think that's a lesson that the whole Western world can take to heart, so that indigenous communities and minority communities can take action and be more have more of a protagonist role in the coming years. So, 2 points that he raised: the food sustainability and the hydric resources. Those are two issues that are very key to understanding the political situation of indigenous villages in Brazil. He gave us some examples for some episodes in his community, but I believe we can, to a certain point, generalize that to other communities in Brazil. They might be experiencing some of the same issues. In this context of what we've been talking about, we have to understand that we're in a scenario, in a context that is very unfortunate, because the indigenous peoples that live in the forest are still going to suffer a lot. Unfortunately, it's what they call the gray hunger. It's when everything is burned down, everything is lost. This is the scenario that he's bringing to us, that he's informing us, and I believe this is going to persist. A scenario in which nature has been burned down and the people who live off of it are hungry. So this live stream is important, looking for collaborators and other actors in this quest. It's important to remember that the Pantanal is a UNESCO protected heritage site ever since 2012. So this is a worldwide problem, and not only we had to look beyond the environment, but also look at the population, the people who are living there. And in this context, retaking my main point, the government is failing immensely in helping these populations, and throughout Brazil, really. We're observing situations of negligence and lack of care and destruction, not only in the water crisis, in the arsons and burnings of the Amazon and the Pantanal, also in the COVID pandemic. And we can see that the state is not trying to have a conversation with the local communities, these traditional communities, the indigenous villages. They can bring us lessons, as has previously been said. They have a lot to teach to us, and the government is not trying to articulate this conversation. We have to keep in mind that the indigenous populations have survived these kind of things for thousands of years. I would say that 12,000 years ago, a great climate change happened, and they survived that. We have records of that, archaeological records. And one thing that the government is failing tremendously right now is to listen to these communities and see what they have to teach us. So yeah, in that context of climate crisis and water crisis and food crisis and arson crisis, the federal government specifically, but also the state and city governments, they have been failing to articulate this conversation. So we can think that the government and the public officials, they don't think in the day-to-day of indigenous communities and tribal villages. There is no concern in preserving lives of these communities. We've noticed that, and it was very striking when we think about the current pandemic of COVID-19, because the emergency plan approved by the Senate and signed by the presidency received many vetoes, one of these. An article that was to bring water to traditional communities was vetoed. And as Stefan mentioned, they have water problems. So water in a humanitarian crisis, that's basic. And this is a point that I want to raise. I believe that the federal government is failing tremendously in this point. The fire burned down everything, as Esteban said. This is the scenario that we're dealing with. And now, when the rain comes, there will also be a very serious problem, which is called the dequada, which is when the ashes that were burned, they're brought by the waters and the winds to inside the rivers. This creates a physical and chemical alteration in the water that leads to the death of many aquatic lives. This is already a reality that's happening right now with some rains, but still not rain season, so it's only gonna get worse. So all the issues that Stefan brought up, I stand behind them. And there's a governmental agency roundtable trying to figure this out, and I was part of some of their meetings in a forum, because we have a representation in the regional fishermen's association. We brought up two issues: that first, that the indigenous population have to be heard, and second, that a plan for disaster management and prevention has to be made, outlined, drafted in some way in order to protect these indigenous populations. So this is in the general context, but what we've been seeing since 2019 with the change of federal government into a government that's ultra right and anti-science, anti-vaccination. What I'm bringing up is known throughout Brazil. They believe in anti-science and conspiracy theories and disregards climate change, flat earther, against traditional communities, against nature. This is the scenario that we have to deal with right now with our federal government. And with this, we also see one key aspect that is not talked about as much outside of Brazil, but there's been a dismantling and an attack on regulatory agencies within Brazil. So like IBAMA, for example, that is an institution for preservation of wildlife. All their coordinators have been replaced by the federal government. Their technical knowledge and technical professionals have been changed into political nominees. The same can be said to be happening in other institutions, such as the National Foundation for the Indigenous, the Palmares Foundation that works with the Quilombos, and also the Institute for the Artistic Heritage of Brazil. So all of these institutions have been attacked, and their members of regulation have been changed into political nominations instead of technical skills.
When you talk about the sanitary crisis, you mentioned a graphic that I thought about showing it to people and
Sure.
talking about it.
Right. So this graphic, it's official data from CESI, which is in the bottom. These numbers are are questioned by other institutions in Brazil, but the reason I bring this up is because we can see that the growth of COVID in Brazilian indigenous populations is tremendous. We can see that from April to May, we see about 800 more infections, and then from May to June, we see almost 5,000. And then in the next month, it goes to 13,000. The next month, it goes to 22,000 infections only in the indigenous populations. And it keeps growing all the way to October, when we reached almost 30,000. Today, the 14th of October, the number is 30,569 cases. One thing that's not brought up usually is the number of testings. That's something that we have to take into account. There's a lawsuit going on in the Brazilian court against the vetoes, the presidential vetoes in that aforementioned health relief article that I brought up. So they're trying to overturn that in the Brazilian Supreme Federal Court. So only when the federal court got involved is it that more faraway communities were assisted by the government. So we can see that this is a very serious problem, and it takes action to change that. So it's important to think that in Brazil, in the midst of the pandemic, the Brazilian health ministry had spent 3 months without a president because of hydrochloroquine usage. The president wanted to support that, and his minister didn't. So there was some tension there. He got changed, and right now the health minister has no technical qualifications for that. He's just a public political appointment. So we see that the government really has not been shy about not caring about this issue, and the Brazilian government is still trying to defend hydroxychloroquine and spending a lot of public money in a drug that has not been tested, in a medication that is not being used throughout the world, and it's using these medications in the indigenous population, the treatment of indigenous tribes, and that's, to me, that's something that I can call a genocide. They're woefully disregarding the lives of these indigenous communities by prescribing them a drug that has no tested qualification.
Stefan, how was the COVID experience for you and your community? How did your community suffer from this COVID crisis? How did they deal with it?
So most of the indigenous villages now have electrical access and TV and journals and newspapers, that kind of stuff. So when the pandemic began, in other parts of the world, there was a lot of fear here with regards to how is this going to arrive in Brazil? How is this going to impact us? There's a psychological pressure that brings you down, an expectation of what might happen. And our villages have a lot of cultural and reliance on each other. And so when the first community got infected, most others, it was inevitable that they also got infected. So a lockdown was enforced in most of the villages, but we were not as affected personally. There were some losses, but there wasn't a catastrophic loss of human life. We had the loss of a young lady, for example, and that hit us hard. But the great impact that I think that left us, because our people are known for their funerary rites, one of the most well-known funerary rites in the world for indigenous populations. So in light of that, we couldn't make those funerary rites, and that brought a lot of impact to our community. So my uncle, we couldn't honor his passing in the traditional way because we handle the body. We have a very specific set of traditions. So there was a lot of psychological impact and sociological impact to us. So yeah, that's the kind of impact that we mostly suffered from.
He's muted again.
So he's restating the funerary aspect and how that affected them.
Can you explain a bit about this funerary rite?
So a Bororo funeral, when someone passes, they are taken to a communal space in the village, and the whole village passes through a grief and an emotional passage. There are many traditions that a deceased must undergo, this is when, for us, the life truly happens. It's said that the Bororo lives in death, because it's only in death that you truly pass into becoming a person. That's where your identity is constructed. So this affects the whole community. This is a process that takes upwards of 3 months until their body is buried in the middle of the village. Their body decompose, and after that we take away the bones, we wash their bones clean, we embezzle them with resins. It's a very minutious process. It's a very, very traditional process. There's singing and dancing and laughter and crying, and it's the apex of our lives as Bororo people. And once only bones remain, we put it into a funerary urn, and it takes 3 more days for people to say their goodbyes, so their spirit can pass on to the next world. And so, for example, my uncle, who was the leader of his clan, he died of COVID, and he couldn't be honored in this way. Nothing of the sort happened, which is an outrage for us as Bororo people. This is the apex of his life. He was the leader of a tribe, and we could not do this to him. So that was horrible.
I think this is very symbolic, what you're saying. When you mentioned that, it comes to mind a performance. This performance is, they are women, and they, for each death, they come in with a black balloon in their mouth, and they put it on a room. Throughout time, the room gets fulfilled. And this reminds me of what you're saying, because people don't have the notion of how many deaths, and they can make a homage from the people that died. Anna's also here. She hasn't talked yet. Ana Paula is from ICV, which has monitored a lot of the fires in the Pantanal, and I want you to explain what's happening there. Right. Thank you, Luna. Pleasure. I didn't say anything, but I'm following. Very happy to hear what they're saying. I work in this institute, which is a governmental institute, and our work is basically for the state. And we work monitoring the forests, everything about the forest. And one of our works are following the fires right now. And right now that we have this crisis with the fires, but in reality also the 3 other biomes in the states are also burning. So not only the Pantanal. This is a scenario that it's very critical right now. For example, in São Paulo, they had one day that was basically night because of the fog that came from the fires. 25% of the biome is... She's talking a bit fast for me. Yeah, 1/4 of the Pantanal has been already affected by the fire, which is an impact that we can't even think how the consequences are gonna be for the biosystem, for the animals and the plants. In the Pantanal in Mato Grosso, which is a state in Brazil, the Pantanal is in Mato Grosso do Sul and Mato Grosso. But here in Mato Grosso, this is already a third. So 34% of the biome is completely affected by the fires, and we have reported a lot about these animals. But the Pantanal also is a habitat for communities and indigenous communities. In Mato Grosso, there are 3 indigenous communities in this biome. And these communities have been burned. 75% of these communities have been burned. And there are a lot of communities that depend on this biome. They are suffering because of the fires, they are suffering because of the COVID, and they are suffering because of the water resource. the water level of the river has never been this low. They don't have access to water, and this water wouldn't even be only for the fires, but to support them. There's a campaign happening right now with women, and these people are
It is
asking
called
for
SOS
donation.
Pantanal.
Yes, these Filhos do Pantanal. They are asking for donations to replant and to resource, and we are following them to help with the logistics problems and with everything they need. I separated a bit of material here from the institute. I want to show you guys. So this is one of our data from the institute. So if you go to Pantanal, the biome, to see how what's in yellow, it's 2020, and 2019 is red. When you select the most intense fires period, you can see how intense were the fires this year compared to the following year. For example, in September, we had almost 6,000 fire spots. In October, we already have 3 times more fire spots than last year. So this is a very, very critical situation. We're glad that this data exists, that we are able to monitor, still are able to monitor. And this is a very sad scenario that has a lot to do with the climate change and the climate change situation because of the drought. And we also have the deforestation from the Amazon, which also influences in the rains that happen in the Pantanal. So the humidity changes and the fire starts. So because of the deforestation, we have lack of rain in this biome, which also influences in this result. We right now we are coming back to this deforestation scenario because we tried to stop in the last 10 years, and now we are coming back and the deforestation is happening again. And the public, the government doesn't help without, they're not inserting money in this type of research and to control the deforestation either. So maybe we can go back to Luciano because he wanted to talk about the fires and what Ana Paula said. So Luciano, you can talk.
Thank you all. I think it's even easier if I speak, because most of what I'm saying are things that Stefan has already said. So also an extension of what Ana Paula has shown us. I'd like to call attention to a very dramatic situation that Esteban brought up in the context of the sanitary and water crisis. He talked about the Bororo funeral and how complex it is. And right at the beginning, he mentioned that the situation, these losses, and the not having this funeral psychologically affects the whole community. We're talking about food safety, we're talking about scorched earth, environments completely burned down. But it's important that we don't lose sight of the human element in this. And these other paths must be taken into account. The psychological trauma, the psychological damage that these communities go through. And as everyone can see, this affects everyone. And the indigenous populations are in a very dramatic situation, given the relationship that they have with the body, the spiritual connection. The bones are ritually handled. There's a whole complex ritual. And the reason I bring this up is that it is very hard for these indigenous populations right now in Brazil, for the aforementioned crisis. What I think is also important, and something that I would like to bring up. So it's the pandemic and the environmental crisis. So these two crises, when they meet, what happened with people with respiratory problems in health facilities? What we do in Brazil is to bring stability only in appearances, but the news do not talk about the testings, how these testings are made, how intense they are. So we have these two humanitarian crises going on at the same time, both the pandemic and the burning of the Pantanal and also the Amazon. And when you have these two crises meeting and they're both exacerbated, and some of the data that we have being published right now are from 1 month ago. So it's a tough situation, and to exacerbate all of that, this is an election year in Brazil. So there's a tendency, and this has to be checked, there's a tendency for omission and for sub-reporting from public officials so they don't look bad because it is an election year. This is not something that is talked about, and knowing Brazil, this is not something that would be a surprise to any of us. So Brazil has been known throughout the pandemic, throughout the world, for the low number of testing.
It's also important to talk about how indigenous people are tested and they are not counted as indigenous people. They are counted as the rest of the population.
And from that, there's also another issue, that is the indigenous people who live in cities, in urban centers, they're still indigenous. It's not where they live that defines them. It's a cultural and historical context, and they might be inserted into an urban environment, but that does not make them not indigenous population, and they're not being counted as indigenous populations. The first case of an indigenous woman being contracting COVID was an indigenous woman that lives in a city, and she was not counted as an indigenous. Eventually, an organization appealed to the Brazilian Supreme Court with regards to this situation, that indigenous people living in urban centers being not counted. So maybe Esteban can bring some of his perspective into that. But inside this context, in which that in Europe, for example, the second wave is already coming. Cities are closing or going to lockdown. So Madrid and Barcelona, and Portugal, and here in Brazil we have the first wave that still has not been fought off. It hasn't been contained. It hasn't been addressed. So it wouldn't be a surprise if there's a rise in the number of cases, because we have not learned how to deal with the pandemic. So it wouldn't be a surprise at all if there's a rise in the number of cases after the elections. So in summary, there is a relationship between the people with COVID symptoms are meeting with the people with respiratory problems from the burnings and from the arsons from the burning of the Pantanal in the health facilities. And both of these affected communities are being exacerbated, and the air is unbreathable in a lot of these places. So can you imagine what it's like for a person with COVID having to breathe in fumes from smoke and from fire? I can imagine how hard it was for the indigenous population to fight off the fire without equipment, proper procedures. They're not firefighters, but I admire what they've done, and I support their campaign. And I also support the ICV that Anna works for, and their work is invaluable. So we have to think about what the next year is going to look like. So it's a shame that the public officials do not care about these communities. And what you see is that the local communities, for example, I have a work with fishermen that I do. I have a project, and you could see that not only, as Stefan said, the indigenous populations are taking action, but also these fishermen. So it's always up to the local communities to rise up and try to put out fires and try to help those affected. We're seeing that it's never public officials, it's never the federal government. It's always left up for the affected communities to pick themselves up at their bootstraps and try to better themselves and try to to alleviate these situations, that it's not their fault. So talking about a very, very faulty action by the federal government. I think in a general way, why the fire happens, for example, in 2019 we had a lot of dry climate, unusually so. So the federal government knew this. There was no planning. There was no specific countermeasures taken against that. We all had this information that the Pantanal was very dry, and there was no plan gone into effect. There was no planning from their part. And there was no financial investment into firefighting, trying to contain what could happen, was bound to happen, which is the burning of the Pantanal. In another light, it's important to bring forth that the data from the police and the investigations show that the biggest fires have been made so they can burn down the forest and turn it into cattle ranching and plantations. So we're living these crises, this climate crisis, this water crisis, and we know who the culprits are, but the government does nothing. So the biggest factor to contain the fire in the Pantanal is the rivers and the waters. This climate crisis is for sure exacerbated by human action, but there are also factors associated with it. So, for example, as I said, the biggest containment of fire in the Pantanal is the waters, and not only the rivers but also the rain. And in this context of 2014 being unusually dry, it was expected that something might happen, that something would happen. And the investigations have to be made, and impunity cannot be tolerated. What's at stake here is the juridical situation, the justice of the whole country. It's very important to bring forth a document in which ecologists got together with people from the
Agriculture.
and the conclusion was that the current situation in Brazil is good for no one. It's prejudicial because only investors are being paid.
Not only investors are being paid, so it's a no-win situation for anyone. So neither for the agriculture people or for the people who are actually concerned with the climate.
And one thing in particular is that, again, the local communities are not informed. They don't have a voice in these conversations. They're not even asked to participate in them.
So the violations, they are also violations against the communities because they don't participate in the problem and they are affected directly. Also in the region, there are innumerous hydroelectric dams, which already is a problem for the water resources, the mining, the monoculture from the big agriculture owners.
So people might remember from a few years ago that river dam broke in Brazil. It was the worst ecological disaster in history of Brazil, and an investigation of the public ministry revealed that there are 7 other more dams at risk of breaking apart and flooding. So what would be the impact in the Pantanal if that happens, for example? So all of that contributes to such situation that is very critical. It's a situation that many different factors lead so that the water pulse, let's call it, in the Pantanal is not normal. The flow of water,
all the other sources that would prejudice this water flow contributes to what's happening right now. And we should have planned and we should project these effects and plan ahead.
So, for example, there are projects for hydroways in Paraná, and for these to happen, they have to transpose rivers, they have to block off rivers, and this has an enormous environmental impact that's not actually being studied. They're just making things as they go. There's no environmental planning for this. What's being thought of is that so the Regional Council for Water Resource in Mato Grosso is enabling the usage of underground waters, and this is disastrous because underground waters are a source of supply for rivers and for other water resources above ground. So we're having a complete mauling of our environment, an outrageous exploitation of our water resources, of our ecological resources, and the federal government is not only not helping, they're actively incentivizing it. And they need to listen to the local population, they need to listen to the affected population. And this needs to become public policy. Their opinion, their needs have to be taken into account. They need to be considered in the public houses and public spaces. These communities have to be heard. They have to have their voices heard. Because, for example, what's been happening is that the
Environmental Ministry has been affected, and a lot of the spots for the public servants were blocked, and that should not happen in the state area. That should not happen in the state jurisdiction, because what we are seeing in the state government is a consequence of a very, very bad crisis in a federal government.
So basically, these are the issues that I wanted to bring up with regards to the causes of the fire, how the fire affects and how it spreads, and how it affects not only people who are suffering from inhaling smoke, but also people who are suffering from COVID in Mato Grosso. And I think we have to think about also we also have to consider the Planalto, which is where the rivers that flow into the Pantanal come from. So all that has to be taken into account in the Pantanal policy.
Thank you so much, Luciano. Now she's asking if one of the other participants have something to contribute to the conversation, Ana Paula or Esteban.
Well, Luna, I think as a general impression, what remains is that we're seeing a very sad scenario of environmental pollution and degradation, and we're walking towards an irreversible scenario every day. It's only getting worse and worse, and we will have to deal with the fallout of this eventually. And there are segments of the population that are gonna suffer more than others. Inequality also comes into effect in this. And to change this, we need a lot of proactive movements and actions that go beyond what we're doing today and we've been doing so far. We have to give more voice to local people and affected communities. Sometimes people don't even look at them, can't even see them on the map, but they're there and they have to be heard because they're the ones being affected. And demand from the federal government real environmental policies. We have, as Luciano mentioned, we've been seeing a dismantling of the agencies that protect the environment in Brazil. And these are the only actions that are being implemented in recent years. It's the opposite of what should be happening. And what's important to say is that this not only affects people who live there, but this is a global situation. And not only is Brazil having their image tarnished in the public perception internationally, so the market also suffers because people who could be investing in Brazil, they don't want to associate themselves with this kind of thing. And so everybody loses, everybody suffers with this. And Brazil is a big exporter of food, especially Mato Grosso. So that also comes into effect, an exporter for the whole world. So it's a matter of time. We're already receiving letters from people who invest here saying that they're not going to buy anymore from Brazil because this is an outrage. And so yeah, this is a priority for the whole country to mobilize and not only protect the environment and the people, but also its own economy. I think this is the main message that we should take. We have nothing to gain from this, and we have to prepare next year because climate change is here despite the naysayers. And most of the burnings nowadays in these areas originate from man-made situations, but they're naturally aggravated. So once they start, it's hard to say where they will end.
Stefan, do you want to talk about something? You're moving.
Hi, congratulations to what Professor Luciano said. I also like very much what Ana Paula has said. It's very true. We don't know what to do now, and the scenario is there. All that remains is what we do with it, because I think we knew what was going to happen. We had data warning us of what might come. It wasn't as big of a shock as people might think. Institutions already knew what might happen. We knew what might happen. And the indigenous populations, we have this very, very strong proximity with nature. And it goes way beyond the material usage of nature. It goes to an abstract spiritual connection with a plant, with an animal. It's a matter of living with the territory, with the land. Even our graveyards were burned of our sacred territories, and this creates a lot of impact for us, spiritual, environmental. And this is the scenario that we're living within right now. And now what we have to do is, against this synergy of negative impacts that collaborated to this situation, what we can do is support each other. The Togo-Baigari Association is a mechanism that we're using it to connect people, to create a positive synergy, to oppose this situation. So the matter of environmental protection, together with the food sustainability, is something that Togo-Baigari is fighting for. Another important issue that Professor Luciano brought up is the matter of the indigenous fire brigades. We're investing in that because we need to have not only a regular fire brigade, but a permanent fire brigade with technical and financial support, not because we want to, but because we felt that we need it. We experienced it, and we're gonna demand from public officials the implementation of this fire brigade. I know that there are a few indigenous populations with fire brigades, and we also need those. We need a permanent brigade for events such as these, and we're gonna fight for that. Yeah, the brigade needs to be financed by the state. We need help for this, and we're not gonna give it up. We're gonna fight for that because we need it. We have the support from an institution that's helping us and directing us, and I believe that made us even stronger with relation to our connection with the land, and we're gonna strengthen it even more. This is the purpose of the Togo-Baigari Association, together with the indigenous populations and the Bororo people. This is our purpose, this reblooming, this restructuring. We're gonna be as strong as the roots of the Cerrado trees, and as green as the Pantanal, as strong as the Pantanal. This is how we have to feel. What about the ashes that these burnings have left? Once it mixes with the water, as Professor Luciano said, will it change the fauna, the animals in the rivers? What's gonna happen? These are the challenges that we're living now, and we have to be resilient, and we have to draft new strategies with constructive dialogues, with science, and with long-term planning. I think with these things in mind, we can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Just wanted to show you guys. Can you see? Sustent Plus. This could be in the name of a project.
Very nice.
This is a sustainability for the territory, for the planet, for the land, and the plus are extensions of this territory.
So the plus, it means the all the extensions from sustainability. It's a matter of surviving, not only a beautiful name. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stevão, Ana Paula, Luciano, for so we could be able to do this. Yeah, one of the purposes to make this live is so we can have donations and we can get donations for these people, this community, for the objectives that they said. Some people were not able to be here, but Stevão is here representing. But I left some links in the description of the video so you can help. You can send the donations through this link. That's it.
I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate immensely the invitation by Luna, and I appreciate the presence of Ana Paula, and I thank you very much for the opportunity of being heard and hearing Esteban Bororo Taucane. It's a good way to reconnect after such a long time, and to hear all of his experiences and what he has to teach us. Not only him, but also the indigenous villages. Thank you very much.